My name is Arnold Kay. I am 75 years old, and I live alone in the same house where my late wife Helen and I raised our only son, Douglas. The house is old and quiet now, nestled in a modest neighborhood in Dayton, Ohio, where the seasons still change with unapologetic honesty, where winters are sharp and gray, and summers are heavy with memory. I have lived here for nearly 50 years, and in all that time, I have never felt as out of place in my own home as I do now. After Helen passed away from pancreatic cancer 5 years ago, the silence settled like dust over every surface, thick and impenetrable. She was the kind of woman who brought sound and motion into a room, an opinion, a question, a comment about the birds outside or the state of my shirt collar. When she died, it wasn't just her that vanished, but the daily rhythm that makes a life feel shared. Without her, the days bled into each other, and the walls of the house stopped echoing. They just absorbed. Each morning begins the same way, with my body reminding me that it doesn't belong to me anymore. The knees stiffen first, then the shoulder with the old injury from my teaching days flares up. I move slowly through the house, making my way to the kitchen where the coffee maker waits like the only living thing. I still make it the way Helen did. 4 scoops of grounds, cinnamon on top, water boiled, not microwaved. It's more habit than preference now. I sit at the breakfast table facing the window, the same table where Helen used to read the paper aloud to me, commenting on the obituaries like she knew half the people in town. Sometimes I pretend she still does, and I mumble responses to the empty chair across from me. I tell myself it's to keep my voice in use. But I know better. It's loneliness given shape and ritual. Douglas used to come by once a month, then every few months, and now it's only when he needs something. The last time he visited just to see me was Christmas 3 years ago, and even then he was distracted. On his phone most of the time, stepping outside for work calls and returning with that apologetic shrug that somehow always turned the blame on me for not being more understanding. I don't want to speak ill of my own son, but I'd be lying if I said I understood him anymore. He was a bright child, curious, articulate, full of ideas. Helen said he was destined for law or politics, maybe both, and for a while it seemed like she was right. But then came the detours, a failed startup, a divorce, a second marriage I've never really been introduced to, and finally, a job in financial services that pays well, but apparently not well enough. He always manages to stay afloat, but just barely. And somehow my modest retirement has become his safety net. I live off my teacher's pension and the savings Helen and I built together over 4 decades of frugality. We never went on cruises or bought new cars. Our pleasures were simple: a backyard garden, occasional trips to Lake Erie, and dinners with friends who are now mostly names on plaques. That discipline left us with a small but solid nest egg, about $180,000 sitting quietly in an account meant to protect me from becoming a burden on anyone. Ironically, it now seems to be the very thing that's made me one. I never flaunted it, never boasted, but Douglas knows it's there. We discussed it after Helen died, when I updated my will and added a medical directive. He seemed supportive then, respectful even. I remember him patting my shoulder and saying, "Whatever you need, Dad, you deserve to be comfortable." I didn't realize until much later that in his mind, comfort might not include me making decisions about my own money. The first signs were subtle, questions posed like jokes, hints dropped in casual conversations. "You don't want to be managing all that paperwork at your age, do you?" Or, "If something ever happened, it'd be easier if I just handled it for you." At first I thought he was just worried, maybe even caring in his own clipped, distracted way. But then the tone shifted. He began talking about investments, returns, opportunities I was missing out on. When I declined, he would go quiet, almost sulky, and change the subject. But it kept coming back, like a salesman with no product, just urgency. That urgency turned to frustration, and the frustration eventually curdled into something darker, something I didn't want to name at first. I told myself I was imagining it, that grief was making me paranoid, that maybe he was under stress I didn't fully understand. But deep down, I started to recognize a pattern. He was circling something, a decision he had already made but hadn't yet voiced. I don't have many people left to talk to about these things. Helen's sister lives in Florida and sends Christmas cards with pre-printed messages. My old colleague Walter passed away last spring. The neighbors are kind, but young, with their own lives and noise. I walk my dog, a shaggy terrier named Milo, down the same block every afternoon. He's old like me, wheezing a bit but loyal. Sometimes I think he's the only living creature who knows me now without needing anything in return. Milo listens without judgment, which is more than I can say for most people these days. I spend a lot of time thinking about Helen, about the years that went by too quickly, about Douglas as a boy when he used to bring home art projects and demand I hang them on the fridge. I think about where things shifted, how a child becomes a stranger, how trust slowly erodes until all that's left is obligation laced with resentment. I blame myself sometimes. I worked long hours, I wasn't always patient, I never really understood his world, and maybe I didn't try hard enough. But I loved him, and I still do, which makes what's coming even harder to accept. Because love, I've learned, isn't always enough. Sometimes it blinds you. Sometimes it gets used against you. Last week Douglas called and said he wanted to stop by, just to catch up. I almost said no. I almost told him I was busy or out of town. But that would have been a lie, and despite everything I still hoped he might surprise me. He didn't. What he brought instead was a storm I didn't see coming, a conversation that started with concern for my well-being and ended with a veiled threat that if I didn't start letting him help with my finances, he might have to step in legally. He said the words so smoothly, like he'd practiced them. "Dad, you're not yourself anymore. You forget things. You repeat yourself. It's getting dangerous." I laughed at first, thinking he was kidding. Then I saw his eyes, cold and unwavering. He meant it. He was talking about guardianship. About psychiatric evaluations, about declaring me incompetent. That was the moment something in me shifted. The fear was immediate and deep, like falling through a floor you thought was solid. I realized then that I was no longer just an inconvenience to him. I was an obstacle. And obstacles, in Douglas's world, get removed. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Douglas showed up unannounced. I had just settled into my chair with a library copy of Faulkner's Light in August, a book I'd read twice already but still found comfort in, when the sound of tires on gravel snapped the stillness outside. Milo barked once and padded toward the door, ears perked more from habit than any real enthusiasm. I opened the door to find my son standing there with an exaggerated smile and a paper coffee cup in his hand. "Thought I'd bring you your favorite," he said, as if that simple gesture might smooth over the months of silence. I accepted the cup without a word, though I noticed right away it wasn't the right roast, and I knew Douglas didn't remember or simply didn't care. He stepped inside like he owned the place, taking in the familiar living room with the same expression he used when entering a hotel lobby. Impersonal, scanning for flaws, unimpressed. I offered him a seat, and we went through the usual small talk. The weather, the Browns losing again, his wife Rachel's work trip to Atlanta. I nodded and made all the appropriate responses, but there was a tension in his movements, a pacing behind his eyes. He wasn't here for pleasantries. After 10 minutes of this polite theatre, he leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, and said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about something serious." I felt my spine stiffen the way it used to when a student told me they'd explain everything After class? Go ahead, I said, knowing exactly where this was going and hoping I was wrong. He took a breath, looked down at the floor, then back at me. I've gotten into some financial trouble. Some investments didn't pan out. There's debt, serious debt. And Rachel, well, she doesn't know the whole picture. I'm trying to fix it before she finds out. I stayed quiet, waiting. This wasn't the first time Douglas had confessed a failure in carefully chosen language. Never his fault, always some external miscalculation. He continued, I need help. I need a loan just to get back on track. Nothing huge. I was thinking maybe 100,000. I know you've got it, Dad. I know you and Mom were careful. He said it as though our frugality had always been an inconvenience, a hoarding habit instead of survival. I stared at him, trying to process the sheer audacity of the request. 100,000. I repeated, not as a question but as a mirror to his absurdity. He shrugged, as though it were nothing. I'll pay it back, once the market rebounds. I've got a couple of things in motion. This is just temporary. I wanted to believe him even then. I wanted to believe that he was still the boy who used to sell lemonade in the summer and save every coin in a cigar box labeled college fund. But that boy had long since been replaced by a man I no longer understood, someone who saw life as a series of angles and exits. I can't do that, Doug, I said evenly. That money is for my care, for my future if I ever need assisted living or home care. Your mother and I didn't save it for you to gamble it away. His face didn't change at first, but his hands curled slightly, a twitch in his jaw flickering. You're 75, Dad. You're alone. You barely leave the house. What care? What future? You could die tomorrow, and all of that would just sit there. Wasted. The cruelty of the words was dressed in logic, and that made them worse. Maybe, I said slowly, but while I'm alive, it's mine to waste or keep. That was when his demeanor shifted completely. The faux concern vanished, replaced by something sharp, clinical. Okay, he said, standing up, if that's how you want to do it. But I want you to think about this, Dad. Seriously, because it's not just about the money. It's about you not being realistic anymore. You're forgetful. You repeat stories. You don't take your meds on time. I've noticed it. Rachel's noticed it. It's becoming a concern. I stood too, anger rising behind my ribs. Are you threatening me? I asked. He held up his hands. I'm saying that I have a responsibility. If I believe you're mentally unfit to manage your finances, I can petition the court. I don't want to do that, Dad, but I will if you force my hand. I'm trying to help you. It was such a clean move. Gaslight dressed as compassion, coercion in the form of filial duty. I felt dizzy, not from fear, but from betrayal. My own son was threatening to have me declared incompetent if I didn't hand over my life's savings. Get out, I said quietly. He hesitated, then nodded like he'd expected it. Okay, he said again, walking to the door. But think about what I said. I'll be back next week. Maybe you'll have come to your senses by then. The door closed behind him, and for a long moment I couldn't move. Milo sat at my feet, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Outside the wind picked up, rustling the maple leaves like applause for some cruel play. I felt the heat rise behind my eyes, and swallowed hard. Not out of grief, not yet, out of the understanding that something sacred between father and son had just broken and could not be mended. The threat was real, and now I had to decide whether I would fight or surrender. The days following Douglas's visit felt different, not just in atmosphere but in substance, as if the very air in the house had shifted, grown thicker, heavier with something unsaid. I tried to resume my routines as if nothing had happened, waking early, walking Milo, reading on the porch when the sun permitted it, and writing small reflections in the journal Helen gave me for our 40th anniversary. But the threat Douglas left behind wasn't something I could shelve like a finished book or ignore like a leaking faucet. It sat with me. Every hour, a quiet malignancy just below the surface of thought. I caught myself double-checking things I used to do on autopilot, locking the front door twice, making lists for groceries I didn't need, rereading emails before sending them to make sure I hadn't slipped into incoherence. The idea that someone might view me as mentally unstable was offensive, yes, but worse, it was contagious. I began to doubt my own memory in small, poisonous increments. Then came the social worker. It was a Friday morning when the doorbell rang, a polite chime that sent Milo into a brief storm of barking. I opened the door to find a woman in a slate-grey blazer, holding a clipboard and flashing a badge. Her name was Claire something, and she introduced herself as a representative from Adult Protective Services. She said they had received a report of possible elder neglect and concern over my cognitive state. The words were delivered softly, the way one might inform a stranger their shoelaces were untied. I stood there dumbfounded, blinking at her, like the words were in another language. "May I come in?" she asked, and though every fibre of me wanted to say no, I stepped aside. She walked through the living room slowly, her eyes scanning everything. The photos on the mantel, the pile of unopened mail, the worn rug that Helen used to insist we replace every few years. We sat down at the dining table, and she began asking questions. Did I manage my own finances? Did I have any recent hospitalizations? Had I ever forgotten to turn off the stove? Did I feel safe? Did I have anyone who checked on me regularly? I answered everything honestly, but with rising indignation. At one point I asked, "Is this about my son?" And she offered that practiced bureaucratic smile that confirms everything while admitting nothing. She took notes while I spoke, nodding gently, her eyes never quite meeting mine. After about 30 minutes, she stood and thanked me for my cooperation. "We'll be filing a report," she said, "and if necessary, may follow up with a medical evaluation." I asked her directly, "Is that optional?" And she hesitated just a beat too long before answering. "In some cases, yes." When she left, I watched her car pull out of the driveway and sat down in the kitchen feeling like a man who'd just been accused of a crime he hadn't yet committed. It was then I understood something crucial. Douglas wasn't bluffing. He had initiated the first move. He had filed a formal report. The machine was in motion now, and I wasn't sure how much time I had before it started grinding through my life. Over the next few days, I began noticing things out of place. The drawer in my office desk, usually locked, was ajar one morning. A file folder had been moved from my bedside cabinet. At first I assumed I had simply forgotten, but after the third incident, I began to suspect something else entirely. I changed the locks. I started sleeping with a baseball bat beside the bed, not because I feared for my safety, but because the line between imagined threat and real intrusion had become blurred. Milo began barking at the window more often at night. Sometimes I thought I saw a car idling at the corner of my street longer than necessary. Paranoia, perhaps, but then again, what is paranoia if not the rational reaction to being hunted slowly? I reached out to a lawyer named Peter Holbrook, a man I had taught in high school decades ago who now ran a modest practice in town. We met in his office, lined with dusty legal volumes and mismatched furniture, and I told him everything, from Douglas's veiled threats to the visit from the social worker. He listened without interruption, tapping a pencil against his knee. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "The problem isn't proving that you're competent. The problem is proving that someone else is trying to establish you're not. If Douglas is pursuing legal guardianship, we need to be proactive." He helped me draft a living will, updated my power of attorney to name no one, and we filed a statement of intent that I wished to remain autonomous unless two independent medical Professionals concluded otherwise. It wasn't a fortress, but it was a start. Peter also advised me to document everything: phone calls, visits, strange occurrences, and so I began keeping a log. It felt surreal, as if I were preparing for trial in a crime novel I hadn't agreed to star in. Then came the bank incident. I went to withdraw some cash one afternoon, only to find that a recent attempt had been made to access my savings account online. The teller, a young woman with braces and nervous eyes, said it was flagged because the password was incorrect multiple times. When I asked for details, she whispered, "It was someone using your son's information. He's on your emergency contact list." I hadn't realized he still was. I asked to have him removed immediately. That night, I sat in my living room, holding my checkbook like a shield, wondering just how far Douglas was willing to go. And then I wondered something worse. Had he always been like this? Or had I simply refused to see it? The final confirmation came in the form of a phone call. It was after 8, and I was in the kitchen washing dishes when the landline rang. I answered without thinking. Douglas's voice was sharp, irritated. "Why did you talk to a lawyer?" he asked. "Why are you acting like I'm your enemy?" I tried to stay calm. "Because you're trying to control my life, Doug. You sent a social worker to my house. You're trying to get access to my finances. You threatened to have me committed." He scoffed, a sound I recognized from his teenage years. "You're blowing things out of proportion. I was trying to help." "But if you want to make this a battle, fine. You want to play games, Dad? Let's play." He hung up before I could answer. The silence that followed was suffocating. Something in me solidified that night, not out of hatred, not even out of self-preservation, but out of necessity. I realized that I could no longer afford to be sentimental. I had to treat this as what it was, a hostile attempt to seize control of my life. I had spent decades protecting Douglas, forgiving his faults, excusing his arrogance as ambition. But now I saw him clearly, maybe for the first time, and I knew that the son I once carried on my shoulders was gone. In his place stood a man who saw me not as a father, but as a vault, and vaults in his mind are meant to be emptied. It was the letter that finally crystallized everything, the moment when theory turned into fact and fear became paperwork. It arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked between a stack of grocery coupons and a medical bill from my last checkup, innocuous in its presentation, but heavy as a cinder block once opened. The envelope bore the seal of the county probate court, and inside was a formal notice of a petition for guardianship, filed in the name of my son, Douglas Kay. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion, concern for mental capacity, necessity of supervision, financial mismanagement, cognitive decline, each phrase stabbed with the precision of a scalpel. There it was, in black and white, his intention not just to take control, but to erase mine. I read the letter 3 times, and by the end of the third, my hands were trembling. Milo sat at my feet, sensing something was wrong, his head resting gently against my ankle. I could feel the warmth of his body, the only grounding presence in a house that now felt like it was collapsing inward. I called Peter Holbrook immediately. He told me to bring the letter to his office, which I did within the hour. He scanned it slowly, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "He's going for full guardianship," he said, setting the letter down like something foul. "That includes control of your finances, medical decisions, your living arrangements. If the court grants it, you won't be able to sign your own checks without his approval." I felt the air drain from my lungs. "Can he do that?" I asked. Peter nodded slowly. "He can try. The burden of proof is on him, but the system is unpredictable. If he presents enough circumstantial evidence, statements from neighbors, maybe a compliant doctor, some financial transactions taken out of context, it can start to look compelling, especially if the judge leans conservative on elder protection issues. I stared at the floor for a long time. Then I said, "We fight." Peter moved fast. He scheduled a series of evaluations with 3 independent medical professionals, a geriatric psychiatrist, a neurologist, and a clinical psychologist. Each one spent over an hour with me, asking questions, performing memory tests, discussing hypothetical situations. I answered every question with a calm determination, aware that my performance was no longer about pride, but proof. I told them about my daily routines, my medications, my late wife, my journal entries, my lawyer. I recounted dates and names, corrected them when they misstated small facts, and made sure they knew I still read Faulkner, not because I was nostalgic, but because I still understood the nuance. Each of them, in the end, signed letters affirming my full cognitive competence. Peter compiled the statements into a response package to the court, along with my own affidavit detailing Douglas's threats and behavior, and a signed log of suspicious activity I had maintained since the visit from the social worker. It was a thick file, and Peter said it would give us a strong foundation. But strength, in those weeks, did not feel like protection. It felt like a thin railing on a windy bridge, something to grip as the gale howled around me. I became hyper-vigilant, checking the mailbox multiple times a day, monitoring my bank accounts every morning, locking and unlocking the front door repeatedly as if doing so could bar the future from entering. I began taking Milo on longer walks, not just for his sake, but because being in public somehow made me feel safer, like a man still visible, still real, still here. One day at the grocery store, I ran into a former student of mine, now a nurse. She asked how I was doing, and I nearly broke down in front of the canned goods. I didn't tell her the truth, but I think she saw it anyway. A week before the court date, I received another message, this time from Douglas himself. He left a voicemail, his voice unusually calm, even warm. "Dad, I think we've both said things we didn't mean. I overreacted. Maybe we can talk before this gets any uglier. You know I care about you. I just want what's best. Let's get dinner. Just you and me. No lawyers. Just talk." I deleted the message and didn't call back. There was no more room for talks. He had made his intentions clear, and his tone was not reconciliation. It was damage control. Peter insisted I stay composed during the hearing, and I tried, though my heart was pounding as we entered the courtroom. Douglas sat on the other side with his lawyer, a younger man in an expensive suit who avoided my eyes. Douglas looked tired but smug, as though he believed he had already won. The judge, a woman in her 60s, read through the document silently for several minutes before asking me to speak. I told my story in a steady voice, careful not to let emotion overwhelm me. I presented my daily journal, the letters from doctors, my clean bill of mental health, the threat Douglas had made in my living room, and the social worker's visit. I told her I had lived alone for years, had paid every bill on time, had never missed a medical appointment, and had handled all my affairs with care. I asked her to see not a confused old man, but a father being hunted by his son for the crime of surviving long enough to become inconvenient. The judge didn't issue her ruling that day. She said she needed time to review all materials. But as we left, Peter put his hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "She believes you." That night I sat in my recliner, watching the moonrise through the living room window. Milo lay at my feet, his breathing deep and even. The house, though heavy with the residue of recent weeks, felt stable again. I poured myself a glass of water, looked around, and realized I still had time. And time, when you know how quickly it can vanish, is the most valuable currency there is. The ruling came by mail 2 weeks later in an envelope that looked just like any other. White, folded, anonymous. But when I opened it and read the judge's statement, a clarity I hadn't felt in months, washed over me like a tide. The court denied Douglas's petition for guardianship on the grounds of insufficient evidence and affirmed that I retained full legal and mental autonomy. The language was precise and unemotional, but beneath its formal weight, I could feel the tectonic shift. I was not only vindicated, I was seen. Still, even as relief settled in, something darker lurked behind it. I knew this wasn't over. Not for Douglas, not for someone who had already crossed the moral line of turning on his own parent for money. I had wounded his pride, exposed his intentions, embarrassed him in a courtroom. A man like that doesn't retreat. He recalibrates, and he did so faster than I imagined. 3 days after the ruling, I discovered my mailbox had been tampered with. The door hung open, its hinge bent unnaturally, and my mail, which included a letter from my insurance company, was missing. I reported it, of course, but the officer was polite and dismissive, chalking it up to local teenagers or a bored raccoon. I knew better. The next day, my neighbor, Mrs. Rayburn, an elderly woman who still called me Mr. K, despite our 20 years of proximity, mentioned that a man who looked like your son had been seen pacing outside my house early in the morning. I checked my outdoor camera, but the footage was mysteriously blank from midnight to 6 a.m., erased or disabled. I hadn't shared access with anyone, not even Peter. That same night, I found Milo's dog food container open, the lid loose, and my mind went straight to poisoning. I took Milo to the vet the next morning, shaking the whole time, though the vet assured me nothing was wrong. Paranoia. Maybe. But when you've already been betrayed once, doubt becomes the only reasonable reaction to everything. A few days later, I began getting calls from numbers I didn't recognize, insurance agents asking if I was interested in alternative coverage, banks confirming new applications, pharmacies I had never used calling about refilled prescriptions. I started to suspect identity theft, and Peter confirmed the fear. Someone was using fragments of my personal data, birth date, social security number, even my Medicare ID, to open fake accounts. We froze my credit, notified all 3 bureaus, filed an identity theft affidavit, and even installed a fraud alert. Peter said this level of coordination required access to documents. That's when it hit me. A year ago, during a brief hospital stay for a hernia, Douglas had offered to help organize my filing cabinet. At the time, I was groggy and recovering. I let him handle it. He must have scanned or photographed everything. Every number he needed to impersonate me was probably stored on a flash drive in his laptop or backed up on his phone. Peter urged me to go further, to revoke Douglas's inheritance in my will, to sever any remaining financial connections, to move accounts if necessary. I did all of it. I named a trust instead of any individuals, removed Douglas as emergency contact from every institution, and established dual authentication for everything, from bank transfers to pharmacy pickups. I also made one more call to someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 15 years, my nephew, Aaron. He's a former police officer who now works in private security. He came to the house 2 days later, tall, square-jawed, and more serious than I remembered. I told him everything. He didn't seem surprised. "We're seeing more and more of this," he said. "Adult children trying to force guardianship, bleed their parents out before they're gone. It's abuse, Uncle Arnold. Financial abuse. And it's hard to prosecute because it hides behind love." He offered to install a full home surveillance system, cameras, audio, motion sensors, even a tracker on my car in case someone tried to tamper with it. I said yes to all of it. The next major escalation came not through subterfuge but confrontation. Douglas showed up again, this time uninvited and angry. He knocked not with hesitation but with force, loud and rhythmic. When I opened the door, he stepped in without waiting for an invitation. He looked worse than before, his eyes sunken, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. "You really did it," he said, pacing like a caged animal. "You humiliated me in court, Dad. You think this is some kind of game?" I remained calm, tried to put distance between us. "I did what I had to do to protect myself. You gave me no choice." He laughed, but it wasn't humor. It was pure derision. "You've always had this victim complex, like you're the noble martyr and everyone else is the villain. But you know what, Dad? You're not some tragic figure. You're a stubborn, paranoid old man who can't see when someone's trying to help him." He began pulling things from his jacket pocket. A stack of papers, receipts, a printed screenshot of my credit freeze, an email I'd sent my attorney. "You think you're safe now? You think you've won? I know where the money is. I know how much you have. And I know that eventually you're going to get sick or fall or forget to take a pill, and when that happens, I'll be right there, picking up the pieces." He walked toward the bookshelf, picked up a framed photo of Helen holding baby Douglas, and stared at it. "Mom would have wanted me to take care of you. You know that." My voice cracked for the first time. "No, she would have wanted you to remember who you are, not become this." His hand tightened around the photo frame, and for a moment I thought he might smash it. But instead he set it down and walked to the door. "I'll see you soon," he said, "one way or another." That night, Milo barked for nearly 10 minutes straight at the back door. I went out with a flashlight and found nothing, but the garden gate was open, the latch broken. Aaron checked the surveillance footage remotely and found someone had disabled 2 of the rear cameras with black spray paint. It was unmistakable. Douglas had come back, and this time he wanted me to know it. I reported the incident to the police, but again, there was little they could do without direct evidence or confrontation. I knew then that the only path forward wasn't just defense, it was offense. I met with Peter and Aaron the next morning and told them I wanted to file a restraining order, change the locks again, and begin the process of placing a legal lien on my property, preventing any unauthorized transfer of title. I also wanted to review the original power of attorney document Helen and I had signed years ago, just to be certain Douglas wasn't still listed somewhere in some dusty corner of legal purgatory. Peter confirmed he was not, but we updated everything just the same. Then came the final straw. A week later, I received an email from a financial firm I didn't recognize, thanking me for my interest in establishing a reverse mortgage. The application, they said, was submitted online using my name and address. I hadn't done any such thing. I forwarded the email to Peter, who traced it to an IP address linked to a co-working space in the same city where Douglas lived. He was trying to borrow against my home, against the last piece of stability I owned. I sat in my living room for a long time after that, not in fear or panic, but in a quiet, simmering grief. This wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't even about entitlement. This was war. Peter filed a formal fraud complaint, and I began the process of transferring my house into a trust, locking it away from any external claims. I created a living revocable trust with explicit instructions that no descendant of mine would be entitled to any assets unless named directly, and none were. I gave Aaron power of administration, and I left a letter in the trust's file addressed to Douglas. Not because I expected he would read it, but because I needed it to be written. I told him that the boy I raised, the boy who once cried when his goldfish died, was gone, and that the man he became had taught me something I never wanted to learn, that blood is not always thicker than greed. I didn't hear from Douglas for nearly 3 weeks after the reverse mortgage attempt was uncovered, and in that silence, a strange equilibrium settled over my life. Not peace, not quite, but the wary calm of someone who knows the next blow is coming, just not from where or when. I filled my days with mundane rituals designed to assert control over a world that had begun to unravel under my feet. I walked Milo twice a day, even when my knees ached. I baked bread from scratch, though I had never done it in my life, following instructions printed on flour bags with religious attention. I wrote long letters to no one, unsent and unaddressed, as if setting my thoughts to paper might pin them down like insects under glass. Peter called regularly to check in, and Aaron upgraded the security system one final time, installing a panic button beside my bed and motion lights along the back fence. Still, I jumped every time the phone rang and found myself staring at the driveway at night, convinced a car would roll in uninvited and change everything again. Then it happened, not with violence or fanfare, but with something far more insidious: legality. One morning, I received notice of a new motion filed by Douglas's attorney, claiming that recent behavioral episodes, unexplained absences from scheduled meetings, refusal to return family calls, alleged disorientation observed by a neighbor, constituted renewed evidence of cognitive decline. The language was nastier now, less veiled, dripping with condescension masked as compassion. They cited supposed community concerns about my ability to manage independently and requested an emergency hearing to reconsider guardianship, bolstered this time by letters allegedly written by two neighbors claiming I had acted confused or appeared lost in recent weeks. One neighbor's name was real, but the quote attributed to her was not. The other was someone I didn't know at all. It was a web of half-truths and complete fabrications, but Douglas's legal team had shifted tactics. They were trying to wear me down through attrition, betting that eventually age and fear would do what paperwork couldn't. I took the packet straight to Peter, who read it with a stoicism I admired and hated. "He's doubling down," he said. "He's hoping to establish a pattern. And if we keep having to fight this over and over, eventually the court may agree to a long-term psychiatric evaluation just to settle the issue. That's what he wants. He doesn't have to win outright. He just has to drag this out until you get too tired to fight." I stared at the documents in his hand, wondering when my life had turned into a series of formal affidavits. I said, "Then we end it, whatever it takes." "We finish it now." Peter looked at me carefully and asked what I meant. I told him I wanted to do the one thing I had avoided all along: confront Douglas on my terms, not as a father, not as a victim, but as a man who had finally stopped expecting anything redemptive from the blood he shared with another. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about closure. Peter warned me that emotional confrontation could be risky, especially if it provoked Douglas into further legal aggression. I said I didn't care. If a man is going to be hunted in his own home, he has the right to face the predator and show him he isn't prey. I called Douglas from a disposable phone Aaron had provided. He answered with surprise, masking it poorly. "Dad? Is everything okay?" I told him I was willing to meet. Neutral ground, no lawyers, just him and me. He agreed too quickly, like a man who thinks he's about to win a game that's already been rigged. We agreed to meet at the quiet cafe near the park, where Helen used to feed ducks on Sunday afternoons. It was a warm day, unusually bright for the season, and I arrived first, choosing a table under the awning by the side entrance. Douglas walked in wearing a tailored coat and sunglasses, as if dressing the part of the misunderstood heir. He sat down without shaking my hand. I looked at him for a moment, just looked, and realized how unfamiliar his face had become. Paler than I remembered, thinner, his eyes restless, incapable of stillness. He started first. "I appreciate you reaching out. This thing's gone too far." "I think we both said things in anger." I interrupted him before the rehearsed truce could unfold. "I'm not here to reconcile. I'm here to tell you that this is over. You will not get my money. You will not get control. You will not get to rewrite who I am in the eyes of a court or the public or your conscience." He smirked and said, "You always did love your monologues." I leaned forward. "Listen to me, Douglas. I have documented everything. I've closed every account. I've moved every asset. I have statements from specialists, and I've signed over administrative power to someone who will bury you in legal countermeasures for the rest of your life if you so much as breathe toward another motion. You're done. He shifted uncomfortably, then tried one last play. You think locking it all down makes you safe? It just makes you isolated. Alone. You'll die in some apartment with no one to bury you. I said, better that than die under the same roof as someone who calls that love. He stood up sharply, knocking his chair back. People turned to look. He leaned down and hissed, I'll ruin you. I looked him straight in the eyes. You already did. You just didn't realize I had the strength to rebuild after you were gone. He left without another word. The silence he left behind was not empty. It was liberating. I stayed at the cafe long after he was gone, drinking coffee that had long since gone cold, watching the light shift across the sidewalk. I thought of Helen, and how she might have handled all this with more grace, with softer edges. But I also thought that maybe, just maybe, she would have been proud that I had drawn a line and defended it. It's been just over a year since that final meeting at the cafe, and though the war my son waged against me ended without a signature or gunshot, the aftermath still hums beneath my skin like a memory I can't completely file away. There have been no more letters, no petitions, no calls from attorneys or fake insurance agents, no more shadowy cars idling at the end of my driveway. Whether Douglas finally accepted defeat or simply shifted his hunger elsewhere, I don't know. I don't ask. I don't search. I've removed every trace of him from my documents, my home, my digital life. The only place he remains is in a locked drawer upstairs, in a box that contains old photographs I no longer look at. Sometimes I think I should burn them. Sometimes I think the act of keeping them, untouched and hidden, is its own kind of justice. After everything, I still live in the same house, though it no longer feels like a house that holds echoes. It feels like a shelter now, a place where silence means peace and solitude isn't something to fear. Milo's still with me, though slower than before. We take our walks earlier in the day now, and we go shorter distances. He limps sometimes, and I carry him when I have to. He still barks at birds and small children with the same indignation, as if warning the world that nothing will get past him without notice. I envy him his simplicity. There's something holy about the way a dog trusts even after betrayal has touched his leash. I've started volunteering once a week at the local library, reading aloud to kids whose parents can't pick them up until late. They don't know my name at first, but they listen. I bring in books from my own shelf, battered paperbacks with underlined passages and coffee stains, and I let them choose the stories. They always pick the ones with dragons. I think they like the idea of something dangerous being tamed by courage. I understand that now in a way I never did before. I also give talks occasionally at a senior center on financial self-protection and legal autonomy. Nothing dramatic, just quiet guidance. I tell them to get their papers in order, to write down every password, to lock their mailboxes and trust their instincts. I don't name names. I don't share the full story. But when they ask why I'm so specific about guardianship clauses and power of attorney revocation, I just smile and say, experience. Sometimes late at night I sit at Helen's grave with Milo beside me and talk to her the way I used to when she first passed. I tell her everything now, every twist, every betrayal, every document filed and door slammed. I ask her if she would have forgiven him. I ask her if I did the right thing. She never answers, of course, but the wind moves differently through the trees when I pause, and that's enough for me to keep asking. The truth is, I still love the version of Douglas that existed before entitlement took over, before he measured affection by what he could withdraw. But love, I've learned, doesn't always entitle someone to a place in your life. It's not always a bridge. Sometimes it's a border. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself, for them, is to enforce it. My home is quieter now, yes, but I am not alone in the way I feared I would be. I have regained something I didn't even realize had been stolen over time, the right to live without begging for permission. I make my own meals, I pay my own bills, I write my own ending. No one watches over me, no one waits for me to fail. I've built a life again, not the same life I had with Helen, or even the one I thought I'd retire into with grandchildren and Sunday visits, but a real life nonetheless. A life earned, a life defended. And in the end, I think that's the closest thing to peace a man like me can hope for.